July 1, 1898.
Santiago de Cuba, Cuba.
Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt sat on his horse Little Texas at the base of Kettle Hill and looked up at the Spanish positions on the ridgeline above him and felt something that he would describe in his memoir years later with a particular Roosevelt vocabulary that combined military analysis with personal exhilaration in a way that no other American public figure of his era could manage. He felt entirely at home. Roosevelt was 39 years old, a former New York City police commissioner, former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, author of a multi-volume history of the American West, rancher, hunter, and politician who had resigned from his Navy desk job the moment war with Spain became likely to take a commission in the volunteer cavalry regiment that he had spent months organizing. He had wanted a war his entire adult life, not in the abstract way that politicians want wars, but in the specific personal way of a man who had read everything ever written about military leadership and was convinced that he understood what it required and was certain that he possessed what it took. The regiment he had helped raise and train was called the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, and it had been immediately nicknamed the Rough Riders by the press because of the extraordinary mixture of men it contained: Ivy League athletes and cowboys from the Western Territories and policemen from New York City, and Native American scouts and college football players and professional lawmen who had served in the Indian Wars. They were united by nothing except their willingness to serve and their tendency toward the physical confidence that comes from having spent most of their lives outdoors in demanding conditions. The Spanish-American War had begun in April 1898, sparked by the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in February, which the American press had attributed to Spanish sabotage without definitive evidence, and which had produced a public demand for war that the McKinley administration had eventually been unable to resist. The strategic objective in Cuba was Santiago de Cuba, the city on the island's southeastern coast whose harbor contained the Spanish fleet that the American Navy needed to destroy to establish naval superiority in Cuban waters. The army force that was advancing on Santiago in July 1898 was a mixed collection of regular army units and volunteer regiments that suffered from the specific organizational deficiencies of a military establishment that had not fought a major campaign in 3 decades, and that had been asked to mobilize and deploy to Cuba in conditions and on a timeline that would have challenged a far better prepared institution. The logistics were poor. The equipment was inadequate in some important categories. The tactical intelligence about the Spanish defensive positions around Santiago was incomplete. The coordination between units was imperfect. The heat and the tropical diseases that would kill more American soldiers than Spanish bullets were already beginning to affect the force. What the American force had was the particular quality that American military forces have consistently demonstrated in the first major engagement of every war they have fought: the quality of officers and soldiers who are willing to close with the enemy regardless of what the enemy has prepared for them. The Spanish defensive positions on the San Juan Heights, a series of ridges overlooking the road to Santiago, had been prepared with the attention that the Spanish commanders had given to the strategic importance of the position. The heights commanded the approach to Santiago and would have to be taken if the army was going to advance on the city. The Spanish soldiers who held those heights were professional soldiers who understood their position's importance and who had prepared their firing positions and their fields of fire with professional competence. The American assault on the San Juan Heights on July 1, 1898 has been described by military historians as a textbook example of how not to conduct an assault on a prepared defensive position, and also as an example of what individual and small unit courage can accomplish when it substitutes for the tactical coordination that the situation should have provided but did not. The attack that was planned required multiple elements advancing simultaneously, coordinating their approach to prevent the Spanish defenders from concentrating fire on any single axis of advance. The coordination that was planned did not happen as planned because the coordination of multiple units advancing through jungle toward a defended ridgeline in the tropical heat of a Cuban July is precisely the kind of operation that requires a level of command and staff experience that the American Army of 1898 had not recently exercised. What happened instead was that American soldiers arrived at the base of the heights in confused and partially disorganized groups, taking fire from Spanish positions that had prepared for exactly this approach, and facing the choice between advancing into that fire or retreating back through the jungle. Roosevelt did not consider retreat. He was mounted on Little Texas, one of the few officers in the assault who was on horseback, which made him simultaneously more effective as a commander, because he could see over the heads of the men around him and could be seen by those men, and more likely to be killed, because he was the most visible target on the field. He rode along the base of the hill directing men toward the assault and encountering, at the key moment when the assault needed direction, the specific problem that the coordination failures had created. The men at the base of Kettle Hill were from multiple different regiments and units, mixed together by the confusion of the advance through the jungle. Some were regular army soldiers. Some were Rough Riders. Some were men from regiments that had not coordinated with each other, and whose officers were either absent or uncertain about what they were supposed to do. Roosevelt did not wait for the organizational problem to be resolved through the chain of command. He gave the order to advance, not as a suggestion or a request, but as the direct personal order of an officer who had decided that the assault was happening now and that the men near him were going to make it happen. There has been some historical debate about the precise orders that Roosevelt received and gave at the base of Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill, about whether he had specific authorization for the assault he ordered and whether the men who followed him were properly under his command. The historical debate is genuine and the questions it raises are real. What is not debated is what happened next. Roosevelt spurred Little Texas up the slope of Kettle Hill and the men around him followed. Not because they had been ordered to follow in the organizational sense of the word, but because a man on horseback was going up the hill directly toward the Spanish positions and they were American soldiers and they were not going to be left behind. The charge that followed was not the choreographed cavalry assault of romantic military painting. It was men running up a steep hill in July heat through grass and scrub under fire from positions that they could see clearly above them, with some falling and others passing them and some turning back and most continuing, driven by the accumulated momentum of a mass of men moving in a single direction with a single purpose. Roosevelt reached the top of Kettle Hill and found Spanish soldiers who were already withdrawing toward the main San Juan Hill ridgeline beyond. He turned and saw that his men had taken Kettle Hill. He also saw that San Juan Hill, the main position, had not yet been taken, that American soldiers were pinned down on its slopes, and that the Spanish defenders were still in their positions. He ordered his men down the far side of Kettle Hill and towards San Juan Hill, leading them across the saddle between the two hills under fire from multiple Spanish positions. He reached the base of San Juan Hill and went up it. The fighting at the top of San Juan Hill was the most intense of the day, the last organized Spanish resistance before the heights were taken. Roosevelt was in the middle of it, on foot now because his horse could not follow him into the fortified positions at the hilltop, fighting alongside his men in the specific way that infantry combat at close range requires, personally. By late afternoon on July 1, 1898, the San Juan Heights were in American hands. The Spanish fleet that was bottled up in Santiago harbor attempted to break out on July 3 and was destroyed by the American Navy. Santiago surrendered on July 16. The Spanish-American War, in its Cuban theater, was effectively over. The campaign in Cuba lasted less than a month from the first landing to the Spanish surrender. American casualties in the Cuban campaign were approximately 379 killed in action and approximately 5,000 dead from disease, primarily yellow fever and typhoid, the tropical killers that claimed far more lives than the fighting. The Rough Riders suffered 89 killed and wounded in the San Juan Heights fighting, a casualty rate of approximately 20% in a single day's engagement. Roosevelt returned to the United States as the most celebrated military hero of the Spanish-American War. The charge up San Juan Hill, as it was described in the press regardless of the technically accurate distinction between Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill, became one of the defining images of American military heroism in the era before the World Wars, reproduced in illustrations and described in newspaper accounts and discussed in ways that shaped Roosevelt's subsequent political career in ways that he had understood when he resigned his Navy post to take the commission. He had wanted the war. He had gotten his war. He had performed in it exactly as he had believed he would perform, which was to say with a physical courage and a personal leadership that produced the result he had intended to produce. What Roosevelt understood, and what the charge up San Juan Hill illustrated, was something about the nature of military leadership at the small unit level that no staff college education and no theoretical study of war can substitute for. The moment when the attack stalled at the base of the hill, when the organizational failures had produced a situation where the men who needed to go up the hill were not going up the hill, required a person who would go first and whose going first would produce the mass movement that the situation required. Roosevelt was that person. He had prepared himself to be that person. He had read the histories and done the physical training and sought out the experiences that he believed would make him capable of exactly this specific thing. And when the moment came, he was on a horse at the base of a Cuban hill and he rode up it and the men followed. That is leadership at its most fundamental and its most honest. Not the leadership of organizational charts and staff processes and the institutional machinery that produces military effectiveness at scale. The leadership of a single man going first. The United States recognized Roosevelt's service with the Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously in 2001, more than 100 years after the charge. The original recommendation for the Medal of Honor had been blocked in 1898 by officials in the War Department who had various reasons, some organizational and some political, for not wanting Roosevelt to receive the nation's highest military honor at the height of his political popularity. A century later, the official record was corrected. Theodore Roosevelt received the Medal of Honor for what he did on July 1, 1898, on the slopes of Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill in Cuba, when he rode his horse into Spanish fire and his men followed him up the hill and the heights were taken. He deserved it when he earned it. He deserved it when it was finally given. The Rough Riders who charged up those Cuban hills with him were men from every corner of American society, from the drawing rooms of Harvard and Yale, and from the cattle drives of the Western Territories, and from the police precincts of New York City. They shared nothing except the willingness to follow a man on a horse up a hill towards Spanish rifles because that man was going, and they were not going to let him go alone. That is the American military at its best. Not the organizational machine that produces the systematic effectiveness that wins long wars. The individual decision to follow the man who is going first, regardless of whether the organizational chart authorizes it and regardless of whether the tactical situation justifies it, because he is going and you are not going to be left behind. They went up San Juan Hill. They took it. And the man who led them up eventually became the President of the United States, carrying with him for the rest of his life the specific knowledge of what it felt like to ride a horse up a hill under fire and have men follow. He had earned that knowledge. On July 1, 1898, he had paid for it.